Yes, good morning. Yeah, I hope you are faring well. Yeah, this morning we're supposed to have the advanced computer support, and I want to discuss the various components of the motherboard we have because the last week we were discussing on how you can troubleshoot some of the components. So this morning I want to discuss the components of the motherboard, and I want to discuss the types of the motherboard and the various characteristics depicted by these types of the motherboard. So what? No, the objectives of this topic is to study, for example, the meaning of the motherboard, the characteristics of the motherboard, types of the motherboard, and the various components of the motherboard. Still, we shall discuss some of the softwares which are used to diagnose what motherboard problems. Now, what is a motherboard? Sometimes a motherboard is called the printed circuit board, the PCB. It's called what? The PCB, the printed circuit board, where most of the components are connected. Actually, a motherboard, it provides connectivity between the computer hardware components. It provides the connectivity between the computer hardware components. For instance, the CPU, the RAM, and hard drive, and the video card. These are some of the components in the motherboard to provide that connectivity. We have the CPU, you can have the video card, you can even have the hard drive. So these are some of the components in the motherboard. Sometimes the motherboard is also called the system board. You might see an exam. So in case you see the term system board, the main board, the mobile, or the main circuit board, it still means the motherboard. You have said it's also called the main board, the mobile, the main circuit board. Still, there's even what we call the logic board. It still means what a motherboard. Actually, a motherboard is located at the bottom or on the side of the computer chassis, depending on the type of the desktop you are using. Sometimes the motherboard can be at the bottom. In some system unit, it can be on one side, on the left, for example, on the left hand side or the right hand side. So for the motherboard, it depends with the computer chassis you have, or the type of the desktop you're having. Because most of the motherboard, they are placed at the bottom. They're placed at the bottom. So, you can hear me very well. Now, actually, a motherboard, it is made up of two materials. There is what we call the copper. The motherboard is made up of two materials. We have the copper. And now the purpose of the copper now, they form the conductive pathways on which now electrical signals and the information is sent. The copper wires, they form the conductive pathways on where the information is or is able to pass even the electrical signals. Another part or another material that is used to make the motherboard is called the layers of fiberglass. You have what? The layers of fiberglass, and they are very, very visible. Now, actually, now the purpose of this fiberglass now, they are used for insulation. It's for what? Insulation. Yeah, because in the motherboard we have the positive components and you have what? The negative components. So you must be having layers of what? Of fiberglass. Now let me share a screen of a motherboard. Let me just share motherboard. Just show you. And let me just now I hope you can see that. I hope you can see it. It's that is the motherboard. We have I hope you can see the connectors here. We have the CPU socket. You can see the fan is here. So you can see now we have the CPU socket is here, and you have the type of CPU sockets. We have the CPU fan. You can see even the heatsink now. Still, you can see the connectors here. These connectors, they are here. You can see the Cmos battery is here. You can see the PCI slot is here. The chipset, they are here. Because for the chipset, now you have two. The north bridge and you have the south bridge. You can see when the RAM is here. Now, because you have two types of RAM, there is what you call dynamic RAM and you have static RAM. But in this motherboard now, it is using what you call a dynamic RAM. Still, you can see a heatsink is here. You can see what a heatsink now. And the purpose of this heatsink now, it is to absorb heat. For example, in case your computer is overheating, that heatsink is able to absorb the heat in the computer. Because sometimes the reason your computer might be overheating, there is a clogged dust in the fan. So that is what the motherboard. There are some of the components in the motherboard. Now, I want to discuss now the types of motherboard. We have types of motherboard. There is what we call the AT motherboard. The first one is what we call the AT Advanced Technology Motherboard. The first one, the AT motherboard. The Advanced Technology Motherboard. The AT motherboard. Actually, now these are the oldest motherboards to be used. They were used in the early mid 1960s, no, 1990s. It was the first motherboard to be used. And now the limitations of having this motherboard is that it is not compatible with most of the devices used today. For example, there is no you can install a video card in the AT motherboard. Why? That motherboard was used a long time ago, and it was not having some of the expansion slots, so it might cause what you call compatibility issues. And now for this motherboard, they are used for the old computer. We have computer. Then that motherboard was upgraded. That motherboard was upgraded to what we call the Advanced Technology Extended Motherboard. The Advanced Technology Motherboard. They have what we call the Atx motherboard. An upgrade of what? Of the AT motherboard. The Atx motherboard. We have the Atx motherboard. The Advanced Technology Extended. Now for this one, it was developed in the early 1990s. It was an improvement of the previous what? AT. Actually, for this one, it incorporates other motherboards. For example, it can incorporate what we call the micro ATX. For example, the micro ATX is used in what? In notebooks or smartphones or the micro computers. It contains what we call the micro ATX. Still, there is what we call the mini ATX. Still, we have some computers today able to use what? The mini ATX. Now, what are the characteristics of having the ATX motherboard? What are the characteristics of having the ATX motherboard? One of the characteristics of having this one is that it is able to use less power than the AT motherboard. Its power supply unit is more efficient than the AT, the power supply unit one was using in the AT motherboard. It is more efficient. It is able to save power. Still, another characteristic of having this motherboard, it has wider gaps, so it can allow more expansion. So you can have other expansion slots in the motherboard. The previous one, the AT motherboard, it was very, very small. There is no way you could have added other expansion slots. So these are some of the characteristics of having the ATX motherboard. We have to. It is more efficient in power usage than the AT motherboard. The second, we have said it has wider gaps to allow for expansion slots. And which are these expansion slots? You can have the video card, you can have even the RAM. Then after the ATX, there was an improvement of the ATX motherboard to what we call the micro ATX. So the micro ATX motherboard, it is even smaller than the ATX motherboard. We have the next, the micro ATX. We have the next, the micro ATX, an advancement of what? Of the ATX motherboard, but it was even smaller, the micro ATX. Now, what are some of the advantages of having the micro ATX? One of the advantages is that it is compatible with most of the devices we use today. That is the benefit of having the micro ATX. It is of the components we use today. For example, it is compatible with the video card. We have an extra slot for the RAM. Still, you can even have a video. We have the video card. We have the RAM. We have the TV card. It is compatible. Another advantage, it contains smaller components than what the ATX motherboard. It contains smaller components. So this micro ATX is more suitable for small devices. For example, in case you're using a smartphone, in case you're using a laptop, you can use it can have what we call the micro ATX motherboard. The micro ATX motherboard. Then there is what we call the extended ATX motherboard. An improvement still. have the extended Atx motherboard. You have the next, the result called the extended Atx motherboard. Now this one, it is just an improvement of the micro ATX, but it did not have a greater variation with the micro ATX. The only advantages of this one compared to the micro ATX is that it has PCI slots. It has a lot of what PCI slots. Still, it can use alarm to a maximum of 128 GB. That is very, very high speed, 28 GB. That is the only difference between the micro ATX and what? The extended ATX motherboard. You have seen the first one is what PCI slot, and the second of what 128 GB. And you know today you're saying we can have the extended ATX, and I've said most of the computers today, the maximum RAM I've seen the computer is around 8 GB. 8 GB. Most of the computers have 4 GB, but we can have 8 GB. Especially the DDR3, the Core i7, you can have 2 GBs. You have said you have the 80 motherboard, the ATX motherboard, the micro ATX motherboard, and we have what we call the extended ATX motherboard. Any question? Any question, Ruth? Any question, Matthew and Gakongo, about the motherboard type? Any question? I hope you have understood. Any question? Any question from Matthew? Any question? Ibrahim, any question, Ibrahim? Yeah, in case of, since there is another question, maybe now we can discuss now these components of the motherboard. Yeah, these components of the motherboard. Now, even before I discuss the components now, I want every student to at least name one component you know. I will start from which component do you know in a motherboard contains? This mobile board, which component does it contain, Kakongo? Just give us one before even describe them. Kakongo, which component do you know is in the motherboard? Kakongo, any question? Asking any component in the motherboard you know? Matthew, which component do you know in the motherboard? You can use your mic. I want to hear. Yeah, that is correct. Matthew, he has suggested we have the Cmos battery. Yeah, the Cmos, the complementary metal oxide semiconductor. That is correct from Matthew. What about Batty? What about Batty? Which component do you know in the motherboard? Batty? Yeah, Luz, which component do you know in the motherboard? I want these components. Luz, which component do you know in the
CPU sockets.
Yeah, I want to discuss. Yeah, we have the CPU socket. That is correct from Ruth. Yeah, CPU socket. Yeah, what about Ibrahim? Which component do you know in the motherboard? You must be knowing one to be sincere. You must be knowing one. Now, maybe I will start with the connector side of the motherboard. I will start with the first part, the connector side of the motherboard. The connector side of the motherboard. Now, one of the components we have is what we call the keyboard and the mouse. We have some ports for the what? for the keyboard and the mouse. Now this port actually is used to connect what? The keyboard and what? The mouse. Actually, nowadays we use what you call the USB port. We are not using the USB port, but most of the devices today they have what? A USB extension. So the first connector is what you call, and remember this, let me just share the screen. Let me just share the screen. Now I hope you can see that screen now. I hope you can see that. Yeah, we are discussing the
Yes.
Yeah, we are discussing these components now. This is the connector of the motherboard. This is the components now. So you have said we have the first one. We have what we call the keyboard and the mouse. We have the keyboard and the mouse, and you have said they're used to connect the keyboard and the mouse, and they use what we call the USB port, the serial bus. Another component on that part of the motherboard is what we call a serial port. You have what we call a serial port. Now, a serial port now it is used to connect some types of modem, scanners, and what in digital cameras. We have the serial port. It is used to connect some types of what modem, scanners, or what or the digital cameras. Let me just show you a diagram of a serial port. Let me just show you a serial port. Yeah, I hope you can see that diagram for the serial port. I hope you can see it. Just there's a diagram here for the serial port. Yeah, it is loading. I want to display the serial port. Yeah, I hope you can see now. This is the serial port. I hope you are familiar with this one. You have seen it in a system unit. They are here, the serial port. That is here. This is the serial port. They are here. And you have seen they are used to connect some devices like the scanners and the whole in the digital camera. This is a serial port. Yeah, here. These are the serial ports. Yeah, the serial ports. The next component is what we call a parallel port. We have a parallel port. We have a parallel port. We have a parallel port. Now, most of the printers now, they use what we call, actually a printer can use a parallel port. Still, a printer can use a USB port. So they used to connect either printers or other whatever devices. And actually now, a parallel port is extra large than a serial port. Just show you a parallel port is a bit larger. It is here. Look at this one. You can see this one. It is extra large. It is a bit larger than the serial port. There is a parallel port, and you have said they are used to connect sometimes some types of printers. But we have said most of the printers today, they use what you call the USB. Yeah, as well. Yeah. There's a parallel port. Another component is what we call a USB port. You have a USB port, the universal serial bus. Now, actually, a USB port can connect many devices. It can connect a smartphone. It can connect a keyboard. It can connect a mouse. a digital camera. Still, you can use it to connect to what? A PDA. A PDA, the personal digital assistant, because they have said most of the use USB port, and that is very with you. Have the USB port. Another component is what you call the microphone. Like now, you are using microphone to connect to connect the whole to the video conferencing. A microphone is used, or that jack is used to record sound on your computer. That jack is used to record sound on your computer. Because in case you have just the earpiece and no microphone, there is no way you can record any sound. That is what you call a microphone. Then there is what you call, we have a joystick port. We have the joystick port, but not for this what was used in the old system unit for playing games. We have what? The joystick port. Actually, this port now is almost similar to the parallel port. It is almost similar to the parallel port. Then we have another port, the Ethernet port or the network port. Let me just show you the Ethernet or the network port. It is here. This is what we call the Ethernet port. It is here. Is here the Ethernet, that is this networking cable. The net, and you still remember you have said these components are placed on the side connect of the motherboard. You have the Ethernet port, and you have said for this one, you can connect your computer to a network by plugging an Ethernet cable in this port. Then you still can have another component. There is what you call the modem. Yeah, we have the slot for the modem, and still can use the same slot to connect to your smartphone for the modem. We have the modem slot. So these are some of the components that are used in the connector side of the motherboard. That are used in the connector side of the motherboard. Now, another component of the CPU is what you call the main memory. We have another component of the CPU is what you call the main memory. And you know the main memory, it is also called the primary storage. The main memory stores information that is frequently accessed by the computer. The main memory is the file that categorizes it to. There is what you call the random access memory, and there is what you call the read-on memory. You have the random access memory, and you have the read-only memory. Now, what is the read-on memory? Let me just show you a diagram of the RAM. That have a RAM. It is here. These are the types of the RAMs here. These are RAM. You can have this RAM. This is what you call the random access memory. Have the random access memory, and you have said for this one, it is able to store the information that is frequently accessed by the computer. It is able to store information that is frequently accessed by the computer. For example, in case you are typing some information in a Microsoft Word, in case you are typing some information and the power goes off, that information will be lost. Why? The information was kept in the random access memory. This memory is volatile. It loses information immediately. The power goes off. That is what the RAM. And I said, before you upgrade the RAM, you have to check the compatibility of the motherboard. You have to check the type of the motherboard. For example, in case your machine was supposed to be using DDR2 RAM, DDR2, but you used a DDR3 RAM, there is a way it can cause problems. It can even cause some damages to the motherboard. So you have to be very careful. That is what you call the random access memory. Another component of the motherboard is what you call the read-only memory. We have the read-only. If I go to the read-only memory, we have two types of RAM. We have the static and we have what? Dynamic RAM. We have the static and what? Dynamic RAM. Let me just show you the difference between the static and the dynamic RAM. Let me just show you. I'll share it the diagram on the ROM. I'll show you the diagram on the ROM. Let's show you the ROM. It is here. It is here. This is the ROM. It just looks like the normal chip with the motherboard. It is here. There's what? Read only memory. It is here. You can see that it has some pins. It has some pins. There's about 10 pins on one side. That is what you call the ROM. Now, what are the characteristics of this ROM? One of the attributes of having this ROM is that it is non-volatile. There is no non-volatile. This ROM does not lose information even if the power goes off. Still, this device now, it is used to store information that is responsible for the booting process, the powering up. So all the BIOS settings are stored in the ROM. So even if the power goes off and you have not saved your work, so even if the power goes off and you had not saved your work, there is no way that information can be lost. That is what we call the read-only memory. Still a component in the motherboard. But now in between the RAM, there is what we call the cache memory. You can have what we call the cache memory. And in the cache memory, it acts as a buffer. It acts as a buffer between the CPU and the main memory. Instead of now the CPU retrieving the information from the main memory, the information is retrieved from the cache memory. It is a high-speed memory. It is a high-speed memory, still a component of the motherboard. Then there is another component that is very, very common. It resembles a clock's battery. That is what we call the Cmos battery. We have what we call the Cmos battery. The complementary metal oxide semiconductor, we have the Cmos. We have the Cmos. The complementary metal oxide semiconductor. Now this battery is made up of radium. Now the Cmos, it is used to store the information responsible, for example, the BIOS settings. You can have the date settings and the power settings. That is what we call the Cmos. It has to be replaced after maybe after 5 years. You have to replace the Cmos battery. Then another component of the motherboard is what we have the expansion slots. We have the expansion slots. For example, maybe you want to add a new video card. Maybe in your motherboard, you have what expansion slot. For example, still in case you want to have a TV card, there is what an expansion slot for that. Let me just show you a motherboard having some expansion slots. Now, let me just repeat. For Ibrahim, we said for the CPU clock, it is able to calculate the amount of memory being used by the computer. Still, it is able to calculate profit that is the computer, the internal breathing system of the computer. That is the CPU clock. Now, there's a question from Ruth about the Cmos battery. We say the Cmos battery is what we call the complementary metal oxide semiconductor. Now, this one resembles the normal battery used in a watch. It is made up of lithium. Now, the purpose of this battery now, it stores what? The pulse settings, the time settings, and the date settings. That is why, for example, even if your laptop power, even if the date and time settings remain white, they are still it must be in time. And I'm saying, yeah, for the heatsink now, it is to absorb excessive heat. Remember the component is a matter to avoid excessive heat. And you have said we have two types of heatsink. One is passive and one is active. And you have said that heatsink, which is passive, it do not use any mechanical components. It does not use the motherboard resources. But the one that is called active, it is able to absorb or to use the power in the motherboard. Yeah. So now, yeah, that is good. So we can proceed to the component now. That was the heatsink. Then other component in the motherboard is the SATA. Have the SATA connectors. Now and now for this now the connectors now they're used to connect the hard disk. We have the OPIC drives, and you have the solid state drives. Yeah, some they use what we call the SATA and some use the IDE. Yeah, you can that information I have listed the passive and the active. You can see that. Now another component of the motherboard called the SATA connectors. You have what we call the SATA connectors. And for this one, they're used to connect the hard drive, the OPIC drives, and you have the solid state drives. Just share an image of the SATA. Just show you what are the SATA. Just show you the SATA that is used to connect the drives. We can have this. These are the SATAs here. That is here. You can have a hard disk is here. Just show the speed. Yeah, I want to share this. We can have them. We can have them here. And Walter is making a lot of noise. So we can have the starter there here. And we have said for these ones, they are used to connect the hard drive. Still can be used to connect the disk drives. And still you can have the solid disk what? The solid state drives. For example, you can have the hard disk is here. You can have this hard disk is here. And have others here. They are here, the SATA. Yeah. These are the SATA. Still another component in the motherboard. Now, one part here is used for the data transfer, and one is used for the power. It has two terminals. One is used for power, and one is used for data transfer. One for power, and one for data transfer. That is what we call a SATA connect. Remember, the computers initially, they were using the IDE initially. Before the SATA, there was what we call the IDE. But the computers of today, they use what we call the SATA. Another component in the motherboard is what we call the socket. We have the socket. We have the socket. And you have types of socket. Actually, a socket is a place where the microprocessor or the CPU sits in on the motherboard. It is a place where the CPU sits in the motherboard, a socket. We have what we call the LGA socket, we have the PGA socket, and we have the zero insertion force socket. So you have types of socket. The first one is what we call the LGA socket. In this one, the pins are present on the socket. Let me just show you a diagram. The LGA socket. The LGA socket. It is here. This is an LGA socket. You can see it. It is here. The LGA socket. It is here. And you have this for this one. The pins are present on the socket. They are present on the socket. The LAD grid array, the LGA. This is the LGA. The pins are present on the socket. Then the second part whereby the CPU can lie on is what we call the PGA. Yeah, the PGA. Now the PGA now is the opposite of the LGA. Why? In this case now, the pins are present on the CPU chip. The pins are present on the CPU chip. So you have the PGA socket. Let me just show you the PGA socket. It is here. You can see now we are having some pins on the CPU. These are the pins. It is the opposite of the LGA. This is what you call a pin grid array socket. The pin grid array. You can see them. You have some pins. Then there is what you call the zero insertion force socket. You have the zero insertion force socket. In this one, you don't have to use a lot of power. You just press it on the motherboard, then you lock it using what some levers. You don't use any force or any power. You just put the CPU, then you lock it using some levers. How to cancel that information? We have the zero insertion force. Is here. You just press it, then you lock it with some levers. It is here. Yeah, you can see it. Yeah, it is here. Any question at that point? Any question? Yeah, any question? You can ask some questions. What, any question? Bogo, any question? Francisca, ask any question. In case of no other question, maybe you can proceed to another component in the motherboard. There is what we call, we have a chipset. We have a chipset in the motherboard. We have a chipset, another component in the motherboard. We have this one, a chipset. Now, for this one, this is a group of small circuits that coordinate the flow of data and instructions. Is a group of small circuits that coordinate the flow of data and instructions between the CPU and external devices. A group of small circuits that coordinate the flow of data and instructions between the CPU and the microprocessor, or the CPU and the external devices. They can coordinate the flow of data between the CPU and the cache memory, the CPU and the main memory. Now we have two types of chipsets. There is what we call the node bridge chipset. We have the node bridge chipset. It is called the memory controller, the node bridge chipset. It is in charge of control the transfer between the CPU and the random access memory. The node bridge, or the memory controller, is responsible or is in charge of controlling the transfer between the processor and what the RAM. And actually now, this node bridge, it is located near the processor. Then there is what we call the south bridge chipset. The south bridge chipset. Sometimes it's called the expansion controller. The expansion controller. Now for this one, it is responsible for managing the communications between the peripheral devices. Responsible for managing the connection between the peripheral devices. So for example, in case you're having the input devices, the output devices, and you have the storage devices, they use what we call the south bridge. They use the south bridge. Any question? Any question on that? Any question? Yeah, I'll repeat the purpose of the node bridge. We have said for the node bridge, it is in charge, it is responsible for controlling the transfer between the processor and the RAM. Responsible for controlling the transfer between the processor and the RAM. And you have said it is located near the processor. We have the node bridge. We have that information. Any other question? Any other question? Any other question? Any other question? Now I want to share a video here on how now you can disable this component. You get the procedure of disabling what? A computer system unit. There is one. Let me just share one. The procedure of disabling the components in the motherboard. Let me just share a video here. So I'm sharing a video now. Let me just share one. I hope you can follow the procedure. Are you able to follow the procedure? Can you follow the procedure? Yeah, there is. I'm sharing a procedure from YouTube. I hope you can share the. Able to see that? Ibrahim can follow the procedure. Who else is able to follow the procedure? In case you can follow the procedure, just type yes. Yeah, that is okay. So as you so as you open the system keys now, from this video now, we are having several tools that you can use. So you must be very, very careful the tools you are using. We have said there is what we call the anti-static disk trap, what you to prevent what you call the static or sharp charges. Still, you must be using some drivers. For example, you can have the start driver. Still, you can be using what we call the hex driver. Because now the nuts or the bolts in the motherboard, or in that case, they are different. So you must be using the correct tool.
try not to work on carpets as well, even on your floor. Be very careful. Okay. I would start with the DVD drive because it's easy. So you pull off the data cable and the SATA power cable, right? You may have more drives, just unplug them.
See.
Snipped off all those little line boys, cut it
Yes, I hope you're able to follow that small video on how you can disable the components in the motherboard. So any question, because you had discussed these components, and you're able to follow now from that short video on how you can disable the components. And you have seen now, as you disable the components now, you have to be very, very careful. Assume the cables, because you might cause some damages to the motherboard and to the some of these terminals, the cables terminals. You have to be very, very careful. Then you have to use the right devices disable the motherboard. For example, you can be using a hex driver, you can be using a text driver. For example, in case you have some small components which are placed between the components in the motherboard, you can use the tweezers. The tweezers. Still, you have to use what you call the anti-static resistor. Together, provide what we call the static charges. So, any question from that lecture? Any question? Any question? Any question? Ibrahim, any question? Ruth, any question? Any clarification?